This is Latter-day Presentations, where we discuss topics and issues of faith for Latter-day Saints. Okay, welcome everyone. We have a really rich presentation today.
Yes, we do.
This one's going to be a little bit of a workout. There's no question about it. Today, we're going to be talking about visions of the end times and apocalyptic revelations. What are those? We'll talk about some examples, and we're going to offer some probably unique ways of thinking about them, ways that you have not heard before.
And maybe we just briefly say, Dan, why now? Why do we need this?
Why don't you go ahead and offer your thoughts first?
Well, I think we are seeing a lot of, opposition in the world. We're seeing increased wickedness in the world. Church leaders have spoken about this. And I think there are some very legitimate reasons to be thinking about, the last days and what that might mean. But there's also some dangers there that we can go overboard with there too. So
very good. I think that's perfect. We have all had some exposure to apocalyptic thinking. I mean, just in reading our scriptures, right? The book of Revelation, 1 Nephi 13 and 14, Doctrine and Covenants 29, the book of Daniel. These are all examples of apocalyptic in the scriptures. So let's go and try to get some understanding of what we mean by that. And let's start with a question, though. What would you do if someone that you knew and loved came to you and said, I've had a visionary experience of the last days and the end times and all of the calamities and the second coming of Christ? How would you respond to that, right? We want to talk about that in this presentation. When people claim to have had visions of the last days and the second coming of Christ, should we believe them? What is the nature of that kind of experience? Is it revelation? If so, revelation for and from whom? What does it mean to interpret a visionary experience? And what are some healthy ways of processing and making sense of apocalyptic ideas? This is the subject matter of today's presentation. Now, as we explore these questions, we need to be upfront and tell you that we are not going to give you a precise and definitive doctrinal answer to everything that we say in this presentation. This is one of those situations where we have a landscape of possibilities, and there's a lot of ambiguity around some of these things. And all we can say is that, this is one of those situations where you're kind of looking out on a landscape of possible answers and saying, okay, there are some things that point to a zone in the landscape that's right about here. So maybe the answer is somewhere in this area. All right. So let's begin with some starting assumptions, because we want to be very clear about where we are coming from in this presentation. The first starting assumption, and this might be shocking for some people to hear, is that we believe it is possible to see the future.
We do.
And it's not just from scriptural accounts of people seeing the future. If you go online and just Google premonitions, you'll have plenty of stories and accounts that people have given where they've been given some insight into a future event and it has come to pass. A lot of them are just really simple things like, don't go to the store at this time, and then where they would have turned, there was like an ice patch or that caused an accident or something. There are these kind of premonitions and warnings about future things. Those are a reality. And so we accept that. That is one of our starting assumptions here. The next one is there are end times and there will be a second coming of Christ.
We believe it.
Yep. As believing Latter-day Saints, this is what we hold to, right? Now, the next one, revelation is real, but look, we have some sub-bullets there. And these are pretty important. Revelation needs to be discerned. Revelation is interpreted. Revelation is customized.
Honestly, I think anybody that's had a revelatory experience, especially a more ambiguous one, like maybe a prophetic dream or something, is aware of this. When you're talking to certain people, you remember certain details, you remember certain things, and we're going to go into memory a lot later, so I'm not going to jump the gun there. But we do have this experience where people sometimes bring different elements of that out of us as we're talking to them.
Right. Now, so let's talk about what is apocalyptic. Apocalyptic, it comes from a Greek word that means uncovering or unveiling. Okay. And apocalyptic is a type of a religious experience, a vision or a perception of the end of the world, the end times, and those kinds of things. It's a genre of prophetic literature. So prophets, if you look in the Old Testament in particular, you have a lot of different prophetic genres. Sometimes they speak in poetry, sometimes it's polemics, sometimes it's prose, sometimes they do the lawsuit formula where, hey, here's the law, you've violated your side of it, so here is, God's judgment upon you as a result. There are different prophetic genres, and apocalyptic is a genre. Again, we see it in the book of Daniel, the book of Revelation.
And these can overlap, right? I think yes. Isaiah also was doing a legal pleading against the people or some of the powers around him. And of course, there's incredibly beautiful poetry in there too. So,
right.
But these are distinct genres, even if they can be combined.
Yes, correct. Now, apocalyptic, when you actually talk with like biblical scholars, they argue over the particulars of what exactly amounts to apocalyptic versus doesn't, and they don't always consistently agree on that. But there are some common elements in what we regard as apocalyptic. Some of those are a sweeping narrative of the forces of good and evil in broad geographic and temporal scope. Okay. Destruction and deliverance, and God and God's people triumph. There's a messenger or interpreter, and symbolic and possibly literal representations of things. So this is a very important element here. With apocalyptic literature, there's a lot of symbolism, a lot of things being represented to us using symbols, using allegories. It's oftentimes a challenge to interpret for that reason.
Yeah. And can we add, as God, you have a challenge here, because knowing the future changes the future. So you could argue that maybe sometimes God will deliberately obscure things so that his purposes can unfold the way he wants them to. And if we zoom out, we have to remember God's purposes, right? Which is redemptive.
Correct.
Which is to get people to repent, but to bring as many of his children back into his presence.
Correct. Very good. So let's begin with question number 1. When people claim to have had visions of the last days and the second coming of Christ, should we believe them? And so we have a number of examples of this kind of thing that are documented in this book by Christopher Blythe. And it's talking about apocalyptic among Latter-day Saints. It's called Terrible Revolution. And he chronicles throughout Latter-day Saint history, different experiences among church members, church leaders that focus on the end times and all of those kinds of things. And he talks about kind of splinter movements, even kind of extremist movements that have formed as a result of exposure to some apocalyptic narratives. I highly recommend that book. But what we want to focus on here is that many people in and out of the church have claimed to have had these kinds of visionary experiences. And some church members have used these claims to attract followers and have gone into apostasy and even committed horrible crimes. So we're kind of playing with fire when it comes to apocalyptic. All right.
These are powerful motifs, and we're going to go into why. And like any powerful experience, they can be misused.
Yes.
That doesn't mean
Definitely.
they're inherently illegitimate, but they do warrant extreme caution. The more powerful these narratives are, the more we've got to have all our wits about us.
Correct. Very good. And so we are going to use as a case study this book, Visions of Glory. Okay. Now, this is a book that we see in the news here and there around some headlines. It's a book by the late John Pontius, and it recounts visionary experiences of someone who he calls Spencer, who is Tom Harrison, and that's public knowledge. It contains visions of widespread destruction in the last days and a narrative of the second coming of Christ. And it's tied to 3 high-profile, horrible news stories: Chad and Lori Daybell, Jody Hildebrandt, and Tim Ballard. It was also the subject of a church disciplinary council for Tom Harrison in 2014. So we'll talk about that, and hopefully through this presentation we'll have some kind of unique ways of thinking about this book that are also applicable to other similar material. Now, that brings us to question number 2. What is the nature of this kind of experience? Is it a revelation from God? Is it a revelation from Satan? Or is it a self-generated delusion? And we're going to offer an answer here that maybe none of those characterizations are entirely
Or
adequate.
is it a deliberate fraud, right? To get followers, money, attention.
Right.
Yeah. Which, again, these possibilities are not mutually exclusive.
Right. So all of those are definitely possibilities. And personally, and among, a number of things that I have seen over the years, because these things are not new, right? A lot of people have been putting forward these kinds of visions and narratives for a long time. And I do believe that some of them have been completely fraudulent. But there are some others that give me pause, where I say, okay, there's something here. Now, how to make sense of it, right?
Yeah. And
That's
even
the
Visions
challenge.
of Glory, do you remember the publication date? I want to say it came out in 12.
I think it was
Or
2012.
14. So it's been around a good 10, 11 years at this point.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So as we explore this, we're going to have to do an exploration of how these kinds of experiences are thought of in Jungian psychology. Okay. Now, this is kind of a movement within the field of psychology that had its origins with Carl Jung. And so we need to talk about him a little bit. Carl Jung was the father of analytic psychology. Okay. And he observed that apocalyptic visionary experiences are had among people all throughout the world. And these experiences were and are regarded as psychosis or mental breakdown. Basically, in the field of psychology, among a lot of practitioners of mental health and psychiatry, this is how these experiences are regarded. Now, so mainstream psychiatry considered these visions to be delusions generated by a broken mind. Now, in the time of Carl Jung, this was kind of how people thought of things. However, Jung took a very different view that they are archetypes, which means they are commonly shared by all of humanity. They're kind of forms and, patterns for understanding things.
Recurring themes.
Yes. Yes. And that brings us to our definition break. We need to pause and talk about meanings of words that we're going to be discussing, because these meanings are absolutely critical. If you are not clear about what we mean by these things, this presentation is going to be a struggle, more of a struggle than normal. Okay. So let's talk about some terms. The first one is delusion, the belief in something that is not real. Okay. Now, something can be real while our present perception of it is a delusion. Now, what do I mean by that? Let's say I have an awareness that there is a war going on, for example, between Russia and Ukraine. That is not a delusion. However, if I am telling the people around me that I am in the middle of that war, then they're going to say, okay, something's wrong with your mind. You are deluded. You have a delusion about your present reality. So it's important to make this distinction. There might be an underlying true reality, but somebody's experience and their current perception of it can be delusional. All right. So when we talk about delusion, this is what we mean by that. Now, psychosis is a mental breakdown or fragmentation, and it's characterized by a break with external reality. Jeff, do you have anything more to say on that?
Or an inability to determine what is real and what is not. We call it sometimes reality testing, right? And we can say there's different ways. One of my favorite movies is A Beautiful Mind. And if you've seen that movie, he has these imaginary friends. But what I love about the movie is, as the audience, we think they're real, just like he did. But one of the things he realizes is those imaginary friends don't age, right? So there's a reality test. If these people were really real, they would be aging along with me, and they are not. So there's people who are psychotic have lost the ability to do reality tests. All of us daydream. All of us have wild flights of fancy. But the key with the psychosis is you don't know that it's not real, and you don't have really the mental ability anymore to tell.
Okay. All right. Very good. Now, archetype, you're going to hear this word a lot. A model that exemplifies something. If I tell you that I drive a car, that is going to form in your mind. You're going to have an archetype in your mind of what a car is. Now, depending on the person, what they mean when they say they drive a car is going to be different because they drive different cars. But there is an archetype, a form of what a car is. Okay? Now, a myth, and this is a big one because this is so misunderstood. A myth is a story that is told with a purpose, often to explain something. It may be factually true or false. Even if it is false, it may illustrate a true concept or principle.
Yeah, sometimes people will say, oh, that's a myth, meaning that's false. That's not the way we're using that term here.
Correct. Now, here you see in this diagram on the far left, you have myth, and this is kind of the interpretation or the connotation of the word myth, where it has no basis in reality. It's just a story that is told to illustrate some kind of principle or, advance some kind of a purpose. You might have an insight about human nature, and then you craft a story from it, and that is represented with your cultural building blocks. Okay. Now, another form of myth is right here in the middle. You might have an observed historical reality, and a historical narrative is crafted over that observed historical reality. And then on top of that, you have a cultural representation of historical narrative. So the United States has, sometimes you'll hear references to our founding myth, how we declared independence and fought a war of independence and freed ourselves from the tyranny of a king. And again, that's often referred to as our founding myth. It is true, but it is a story that is told to inspire devotion to our country, to inspire devotion to principles of liberty, and those kinds of things. Now, on the far right here, we have an archetypal myth, and that is what we're going to be focusing on a lot in this presentation, where there is a shared perception of a reality, of an archetypal reality, like a form of something. And then there's an attempt to convey that reality in the form of a story, and there's a cultural presentation of that story. Okay. So in Jungian psychology, the field of psychology that emerged from the work of Carl Jung, you see a lot of this. There's a lot of attention to dreams and visions and mythologies throughout the world. What are these things? What is the shared perception of a reality, the archetype that this is trying to convey? And Carl Jung said that these things offer a lot of insight into what is going on with people, the content of their dreams, and so on and so forth. Now let's talk about examples of archetypes. We talk about the hero, the ruler, the sage, the mother, the creator, the magician, the wounded healer, the jester, the rebel. These are only some examples of archetypes. Yeah. Now, what Jung and his followers said is these are forms that exist deep within us. And we'll talk more about what that means. But these are forms of things that emerge in stories told all throughout the world. Stories that are true and stories that are not based in, historical reality. These show up because they have power. They are extremely useful. They're extremely powerful in conveying things. Okay. Now, there are also narrative archetypes like the hero's journey or the apocalypse or the dying and rising God. These are narratives and stories that, and there are many more that we could cite, but they do show up all throughout the world in various cultures, right? In the stories that they tell. So in the Jungian model, we have these archetypes and they're stored down at this lowest level. And he called it the collective unconscious. And think of that as being like a vault where these things are stored, and we can't, like, just by trying, we cannot break into that vault. We can't just access it because we're trying to, right? Now, above that, we have a layer that is called the subconscious. And the subconscious is a lot of our conditioning. Our life experiences kind of shape our perceptions of the world in ways that we are not often aware of. And those they're almost like algorithms and heuristics, these automatic responses and programs that run below our level of consciousness, right? In response to the world around us. And then we have our conscious, and that is where we are thinking and, interacting with the world around us and actually exercising our agency. So the conscious is our thought processes and decisions at the level of awareness. The subconscious, again, that's mental and emotional processes below the level of awareness. And below that, we have archetypes. And these are concepts and understandings that are shared by all of humanity. This is how Carl Jung viewed the human psyche. All right. Your mind, heart, soul. This is how he saw it working. Okay. Now, let's listen to a Jungian analyst, somebody who's trained in the theories and methodologies that Carl Jung espoused. Let's listen to a Jungian analyst talk about apocalyptic. And this is sort of an answer to that question. If somebody were to come to you and say, I feel like I'm in the end times and I've had visions and I need to tell somebody about these things. Well, listen to what this Jungian analyst says. His name is Lionel Corbett. And let's hear what he has to say.
What Jung found was that all religions and all mythological systems have imagery of gods and goddesses and heavens and hells and imagery like a divine child, a virgin birth, the apocalypse, the eternal conflict of good and evil, messiahs, saviors, and so on. These themes are common to all religious traditions. And Jung thought that this kind of imagery comes from this deep level of the psyche, and he called that the archetypal level of the psyche. And he thought that that was an archaic level of the psyche which still exists in the modern mind, but it's covered over by our rational mind. And what we call psychosis or illnesses like schizophrenia is actually an eruption of this mythic material into the field of the conscious personality, into what we call ego consciousness. And then what happens to the individual is that they become lost in this mythic world. And the people around them, of course, don't understand what's going on with that individual. because this mythic imagery, this mythological imagery of gods and goddesses and so on, is very strange to people, those of us who are living in ordinary consensual reality. But actually, although this mythic material seems chaotic and disordered, actually it has profound symbolic meaning. The problem is that the individual is lost in this flood of material and needs help coping with it. So Jung thought that what looks like an illness or a disorder is actually a natural healing process, working in its own way towards greater consciousness and renewal of the personality.
Okay, let's pause right there. Here we're starting to see this contrast in thinking where, if somebody were to tell you they were experiencing these kind of visionary things, again, our first instinct might be to say, oh, there's something wrong with you, you're crazy, or something like that. He's saying that in Jungian thought, that's not at all what you should conclude. There is a process going on. And he says attention to this process can actually help facilitate something good. That there is something actually valuable happening that can really help this person.
So from the outside, the process looks like disintegration. Actually, it's an attempt at reorganization and renewal of the personality. And people have delusions about the end of the world in a great apocalypse, that they are symbolically talking about their feeling of disintegration and the need for a radical personality change, the need for a new way to be in the world. Graf used the term spiritual emergency to differentiate visionary experience from psychosis. So a spiritual emergency is a non-ordinary state of consciousness, an emotionally powerful experience of connection to the spiritual dimension, and a visionary experience of a religious type that, when it's misunderstood, is diagnosed as delusional or hallucinatory. It's actually a spiritual awakening that has the potential to produce profound psychological transformation. Now, what Perry recognized were that there were these mythic and ritual themes in psychotic material. He recognized that the psychotic person is plunged into these deep levels of the psyche in which the imagery of myth overwhelms consciousness. And that's why in states like psychotic states, we see mythic themes, the conflict between good and evil, God and the devil, Armageddon is coming, the Last Judgment, the afterlife, the triumph of the Antichrist, becoming a Messiah, the cosmic order, becoming a god, death and rebirth, sacred marriage to a god or goddess, becoming a divine king or queen. The new Jerusalem is at hand. I'm the child of royal or divine parents, and so on and so on. This is all the imagery of mythological stories. But that's the level of the psyche that becomes prominent in these states of mind. The experience of becoming very special, very important, a god or a world leader, is an identification with what Jung calls the self written with a capital letter S. The idea is that there is a God within, the central organizing principle of the psyche, and sometimes the person identifies with that and feels that he or she is a god or goddess. And his idea was that the experience of being very special or chosen compensates for a one-sided conscious idea that one is inferior or inadequate. So one common mythic theme seen in schizophrenia is for people to believe that they have a messianic calling, that they're specially chosen by God to save the world or reform society. This is partially a compensation for feeling weak and insignificant or the subject of injustice. It's partly an identification with the mythic image of the hero. In all mythologies, there are hero figures who follow a similar heroic pattern, the hero call to adventure, they have a dangerous night sea journey in which they face dangers, they fight dragons, and so on. And in hero mythology, like the story of Moses, for example, there's often a mythic image of a royal birth, or sometimes the mythic image of a virgin mother, the risk of death in infancy, followed by being reared by foster parents, like in the stories of Moses and Oedipus. These are common themes in all hero myths. And this is the kind of mythic imagery that often arises in psychosis.
Okay, so let's talk about what Lionel Corbett said here. Now, again, we need to go back to that word myth. Myth is not saying that something is not true or that it's not based in truth. Myth is a story that is told with a purpose. So what is the purpose of apocalyptic? Why does this emerge in these situations that are regarded as situations of psychosis, right, in the field of psychology?
Yeah.
There's a purpose to it, is what Jung said.
And that's in contradistinction to most mental health people, because once we've labeled something, we can then pathologize it and then dismiss it. And Corbett's saying, you might have that backwards.
He's talking about some elements here, that these things emerge in stories that are told in cultures around the world, right? And we're going to talk about why that is as we proceed here. But right now, as we just think about what Corbett has been telling us, the point is that these things have a purpose. They serve a purpose in the psyche. And that purpose can be a purpose of renewal and reconstitution of someone's heart and mind in a better way than they were before. So let's talk about another dimension of this. And this is a really interesting component of Lionel Corbett's remarks. If you are a temple-going Latter-day Saint, listen to what is said here. This is definitely going to resonate with you.
Perry also found similarity between the content of psychotic processes and imagery from the archaic religions of remote Bronze Age antiquity, themes that emerged with the rise of the sacred kingships in the ancient Near East and the Mediterranean, beginning about 3500 BCE in Sumer, which is now southern Iraq. These are themes that are found in the Bible and the Psalms. But in ancient Sumer, there was an annual New Year festival for renewal of the year and the kingdom. It was a ritual drama in which the culture's myth was acted out. The king was placed at a kind of mythic world center where the upper world and the lower world and the human worlds meet. And there he would struggle with the powers of darkness, and there was a symbolic return to the creation of the world, with ritual combat between the powers of good and evil, with a sacred marriage with a goddess or a high priestess. And this led to renewal of the life and fertility of the kingdom. You find it in the Bible in the New Year festival in early Israel, when King David was the king of Israel. That's an example. This kind of imagery is found all over the Psalms. It includes images of enthronement, renewal of the covenant with God, conflict with the powers of evil, and so on.
Okay, once again, if you are a temple-going Latter-day Saint, that segment is going to resonate with you.
Yeah, that should set off some familiarity. Yeah.
Right. So there have been, Hugh Nibley was very prolific at this, but a lot of people have followed suit in showing how elements of our temple experience are found in so many ancient cultures all over the world. Now, again, we need to talk about why that is, and we will get there. But it's really interesting, right? Because it kind of forces us into a question. Why would these things show up when someone is in a state of mental and emotional crisis or breakdown? Why would these kinds of narratives of apocalyptic and ritual and coronation and the conflict between good and evil, why would these kinds of themes emerge in those situations? What does apocalyptic do to help the soul? The answer to that question is it situates us in the story. Okay. What I mean by that is when we are exposed to apocalyptic material, when we engage with, for example, the book of Revelation or First Nephi 13 and 14, we can actually see the larger story of what is going on in the world. The forces of good and evil, clashing, and we can kind of see where we fit in this larger scheme of things. So we see injustice in the world and tragedy and all of these kinds of things. If we don't know where we fit in, if we just think that everything that's going on is random, that is cause for despair, right? But if you see this big kind of panoramic vision of, okay, there's a great kind of story that is unfolding in the world, and it is a difficult story, and it is going to culminate in some very difficult things, but there will be renewal, and there will be everything made right? That's a very important component of apocalyptic. That's why we see, in both Isaiah and in the book of Revelation, we see language around all tears being wiped from all eyes, right? Yeah. That's the big story. And when we engage well with apocalyptic material, we're going to say, okay, I see what's really going on in the world. I see where I fit into all of it.
And I have a part in it. I'm not just a spectator, but I play an important role.
Right. I see that there are forces of good, and I can align myself with those. This has meaning. Meaning is a huge deal, right? Meaning is incredibly important for mental health.
Yes, as we see here. Yeah.
Yeah. So a lot of people, when they disengage from these great stories because they've lost their faith, for example, and they've left religion, and they say, okay, I'm not religious anymore. I'm free. I'm totally free from all those myths. Well, now they don't see the story, and they don't see themselves in a story. They don't even see what it means to have a self.
Yeah.
Am I even a soul? What does that even mean? Is there a God? I don't know. Nothing means anything.
Nothing matters. Nothing has any long-term importance or significance.
Right. And the word for that is nihilism. The idea that nothing actually has any inherent meaning. And when a society embraces nihilism, walking away from these stories that are based in reality, right? We see headlines like this: millennials leaving religion and not coming back. And then an increase in nihilism plays havoc with mental health. And then look at this escalating percent of the population with a major depressive episode. And then look at Governor Gavin Newsom of California saying we all need to self-medicate periodically, right? Nihilism, the answer to the pain of nihilism is self-medication. That's all you can do. All you can do is numb, right? And he's being honest about that. Good for him, at least for being honest. But then you have
the therapist in me is freaking out at his quote. But anyway, keep going.
Right. But then you have this: rising costs, therapist shortages, Gen Z struggles to afford mental health care, right? You have this: deaths of despair rising in the United States. This is what happens when people don't think that their lives mean anything.
Don't think they're part of the story.
Right. I'm free from all those stories I was told in church. Okay. What is the cost? What happens when a society decides to free itself from the story? Well, this is it. It's not a pretty picture.
No.
Okay. So now let's go back into the thinking of Carl Jung. And what he said was, down deep in this vault where we have these archetypes, these forms of realities. Those are called the collective unconscious. Now, he influenced a lot of people, and one of those people was a man named Aldous Huxley, who wrote a book called The Perennial Philosophy. And he went throughout the world and looked at different belief systems and said, okay, what are these elements that they have in common? For example, in Christianity, we have this thing called the Golden Rule: do unto others as you would have them do to you. Well, he went around and said, okay, I also see that in Buddhism. I also see that in Hinduism. He would go around and find these similarities, and he kind of brought them together into a book and said, we see some similar points throughout belief systems and religions throughout the world. Now, as Latter-day Saints, we actually have wonderful resources for thinking about that, right? Why do we see these commonalities? Well, one explanation is diffusion, where you say, here's a belief or a principle that has its origin in this place and time, and then it was spread out to other parts of the world. Diffusion is real. It happens. And we believe that some things are diffused. Now, if you are someone who does not believe in God, you might say that, okay, these things, they come to us through inheritance. They're part of evolution. They're kind of hardwired into the human brain somehow. I think that's kind of ridiculous, because so many of these stories, if you look at them, there's no evolutionary
the genetic sequence for the hero's journey.
Right. Right. Where is that in the DNA?
Yeah.
And so many of these things have zero evolutionary value whatsoever. In fact, if you really think about them, they seem kind of counter-evolutionary if you don't process them in the right way, right?
The mere fact we can even talk about this stuff. Darwin, I think even Charles Darwin in his Voyage of the Beagle goes to visit some very, as he called them, primitive, people. These were hunter-gatherers. And he said, even they have, at their level of living, right? It's one thing to have universities and writing and all this stuff, but here, culture with no writing, no school, no formal schooling, no large complex civilization, even they have far more cognitive ability than they need.
Right.
So it's just way overkill. But anyway.
But that brings up a very important point, because Darwin and so many other people have struggled with this. The reason why there is this hypothesis of a collective unconscious, right, that Carl Jung developed. Now he wasn't the only one. He wasn't the first. He was influenced.
It has different names. Different philosophers and people have called it different things over the centuries. Mm-hmm.
Right, and he was influenced by William James, who is just this one of the very greatest philosophers of all time, who believed something similar.
And psychologist,
Mm-hmm. Right.
Yeah, great. You won't go wrong reading. Not that you agree with everything, but he's well worth learning more about that guy. Yeah.
Right. So a lot of people just observing humanity and studying the mind and how it works, studying various cultures, they've kind of come around to similar views about these things. There's something down there that holds a lot.
It's too common and too powerful to just be noise. Random noise. Mm-hmm.
Correct. We are not a blank slate. There is something that all of us has there. Now, as Latter-day Saints, we have doctrines around premortality and the light of Christ, and those offer a very different set of possibilities. For the purpose of this presentation, I want to rename the collective unconscious, and I think Carl Jung, where he is right now, in the spirit world, I think he very much approves of this change. But we don't need to call it the collective unconscious. We're going to call it something different. But look, some common understandings of God and morality are diffused. They have a starting point in one place and they spread out to other areas. But many
people who don't believe in God will say, well, I can't believe in God because my daughter died of a disease or something. You can even see they have an idea of the character of God, right?
Right.
Because maybe God exists, but he's a jerk and he hates you, right? But nobody thinks that. We all know God is good. even
Right.
though it shouldn't necessarily, it doesn't logically follow. That has to be spiritual memory.
Right. Correct. So many things are part of our spiritual baseline in the light of Christ, right? We have this doctrine around the light of Christ. And also, many things are, listen to that word Jeff just used, listen to that phrase.
I jumped the gun.
Yeah, that's okay. Spiritual memories of things that we have been shown. So the collective unconscious, we Latter-day Saints would call it spiritual memory. Okay. We do have this vault and it is covered over with a veil. All right.
We might call it a veil. Yeah.
Yeah.
We do call it a veil.
Right.
We don't call it a wall. We don't call it, because things can come through that veil.
Right. Sometimes we actually get a glimpse kind of into that veil. Sometimes parts of it are open. But even when we glimpse it, in situations like what we're talking about here with apocalyptic, where we kind of get a glimpse into it, there's a lot of lenses through which we view what we find there.
Yeah.
And we need to talk about that. But
yeah, we will come to that. Yeah.
Right. But let's talk about what it means to have spiritual memory. So President Dallin H. Oakes in April 2020, this is very recent. Look at what he said. He said, in the council in heaven, all the spirit children of God were introduced to the Father's plan. Now pay attention to his wording here, including its mortal consequences and trials, its heavenly helps, and its glorious destiny. We saw the end from the beginning. That is a massive, massive amount of information that we were shown before we came to this earth. An incredible amount of information.
The story. That is the story.
Yeah. We have the story within us right now. Everybody does. He says, many also made covenants with the Father concerning what they would do in mortality. Well, we would have made those covenants based on information, and that was a lot of information. Okay. There are a lot of things that we were shown in advance of coming here. Now, in light of what President Oakes said, I want to play a video clip. And this is a commentary that I came across on YouTube. And it's a guy talking about Carl Jung's thinking and archetypes. And pay attention to what he says about remembering and how we come across knowledge and some of the thinking throughout history along those lines. Let's watch this.
There are many more archetypes, and you'll see them at play. You'll see them distributed throughout the myths of the world, and even in your own dreams if you pay close enough attention. Just to rattle some of them off, the Senex, which is the wise old man archetype, the trickster, the mother, the savior, the devil, the dying god, and many more. But it doesn't stop there either. There are also narrative archetypes you'll find throughout the myths of the world. Things like the flood myth, the myth of Armageddon, paradise, the underworld, creation, the hero's journey. And I'm sure most of you know that when I say myth, I don't say this pejoratively or in a way that nullifies its importance or demotes it to untrue. When I say myth, I mean truer than true in a sort of Joseph Campbellian sense, in that these myths speak to something so large, so true about the nature of reality that they can only be spoken of through story, through symbol. So now that we've arranged our concepts, we've contextualized ourselves a bit, we can get to what I think is the most fun, most important part of this exploration, which is diving into some hugely brain-melting, throbbing questions that the existence of a collective unconscious and archetypes imply. So why not start with the epistemological question of all epistemological questions? Where does knowledge come from? If a collective unconscious realm exists, is knowledge something we are accessing from the inside out? Are we really doing something more akin to remembering or discovering rather than going out there and collecting knowledge, going out into the world and collecting knowledge. It sounds far-fetched, hard to swallow because of the way that we've been conditioned to think about the world, but some of history's greatest minds did think this way, that knowledge was remembered or discovered rather than acquired out there in the world, with Socrates and Plato probably being the most famous examples of this thinking, what was called innate knowledge. This is a whole rabbit hole unto itself, but I highly encourage you to look up innate knowledge and what the Greeks called anamnesis, this phenomenon of remembering, uncovering knowledge that we've been connected to all along. And I'm not just projecting this onto Jung, he clearly also thought this way to an extent. Quote, "The form of the world into which a person is born is already inborn in him. Also, in addition to our immediate consciousness, there exists a second psychic system of a collective, universal, and impersonal nature, which is identical in all individuals."
Wow. So think about the implications of this. He's saying there is a shared block or vault of knowledge that we all have throughout the world.
We kind of already know, and we're learning again.
Yeah.
Remembering.
Right.
Remembering, putting it back together again.
Remembering, uncovering, unveiling. Right? So those are, think about those terms versus learning something new. There's kind of a shift in thinking that occurs when we use those other terms. So let's go back to that quote in the video from Carl Jung. The form of the world into which a person is born is already inborn in him as a virtual image. Okay. Now, look at Moses 3:5. "For I, the Lord God, created all things of which I have spoken spiritually before they were naturally upon the face of the earth." So in premortality, if we were present for the spiritual creation, then you can see why we would come to earth with spiritual memory of forms of how things work, because there was a spiritual creation with rules and order that govern how things work, right? And that is what we're talking about when we talk about archetypes. Okay, so now let's talk about a talk that Truman G. Madsen gave at BYU a long time ago. And he quoted Doctrine and Covenants 84, "The Spirit giveth light to every man that cometh into the world, and the Spirit enlighteneth every man through the world that hearkeneth to the voice of the Spirit." And he asked the question, is it then the case that this beginning light is in everyone? Is it a universal experience? There is enough impact even in the so-called secular world that Jung, for example, posits a collective unconscious. You don't just remember your own autobiography. You remember somehow the whole human racial experience. And thus, he says, a 14-year-old girl can have dreams of all the archetypes of human consciousness, though she has never experienced them directly in this world. Or again, Joseph Campbell, the great student of comparative religion and myth, wants to say that myths express the depths of man more effectively than so-called prosaic or propositional truths.
Or what Corbett called consensual reality.
Yep.
Same idea there. Keep going. Sorry.
Yep. No, perfect. Some Eastern philosophers, convinced that we have more in our minds than can be accounted for by this life, okay, a lot of people have come to that conclusion, have concluded that reincarnation or even transmigration is the only explanation. William James once argued that because of this same phenomenon, there may be a reservoir of spiritual insight, which not just exceptional persons, but the ordinary man can occasionally break into and recognize. Rudolf Otto has written about the idea of the holy and calls it the numinous, just as the word luminous refers to light. This is the sense of the sacred that he holds is universal. and isn't discovered or learned, but somehow given. Many of the theists among modern writers in existentialism have talked about a depth self that even our own best introspection cannot reach. Okay? So Jung was not alone among thinkers who have addressed and approached this question of like, how much do we know the moment that we're born? What is there some reservoir of memories and awareness of things the moment that we're born? The answer is yes, according to our theology. Now, looking at this, I want to address a point here. He refers to something here. He says that, a lot of thinkers in pondering this issue, they've concluded that reincarnation or transmigration are the only explanation. And here we want to make a point, okay? Some Latter-day Saints over the years have speculated that there might be some form of reincarnation in our theology, and we want to declare very firmly here, and we're going to do an entire separate presentation that deals with this. It is absolutely not necessitated in any way by the plan of salvation. It's not necessary. It's not needed. There's no need to conclude that reincarnation is a thing.
Or multiple mortal probations is often called. Yeah.
Right. This idea of multiple mortal probations, absolutely not necessary in our theology. And again, we're going to do a full separate presentation that explores why that is.
And in fact, it's caused a lot of mischief, which is why we don't teach it or preach it. Yes, that idea. Correct. Especially in our church.
Correct. Absolutely. So now, as we think about this idea of spiritual memory, do we see evidences for it? And the answer to that question is yes. In our missionary work in particular, and I had a couple experiences on my mission where I saw this in a couple of pretty remarkable ways. But you sometimes hear of people who are studying the restored gospel, and they describe the process as feeling like a memory, like they're, I've been given this new information, but it doesn't feel new to me. It feels like I knew this before. And you hear a lot of stories of people who will say to their missionaries, "Hey, I think you and I have met before."
Exactly, yeah.
That happens all the time. And, if you understand our theology of a war in heaven, where all that war was a lot of conversations. It was just vast amounts of conversations, people persuading each other in premortality to embrace the Father's plan, right? That was the war. It was teaching and conversations. So it should not surprise us at all that when we have conversations about the gospel with other people here in mortality, sometimes those conversations are going to feel like, wait, I know you. This is the first time I've met you, but somehow I feel like we've had a conversation like this before.
Deja vu. Yep.
So I want to show a couple examples of that. And this first one is a recent convert in England, and her name is Darcy. And she did a kind of an online fireside where she told her conversion story. And the way she told it was, she used to be an atheist before she joined the church. And so she wrote a letter to her past atheist self that she calls atheist, or past Darcy. That's what she calls herself. And she wrote this letter to her past self describing what is going to happen to her when she finds the gospel. Let's listen to what she says.
Dear past Darcy, one day very soon, you'll wake up one morning and think it's just some normal day. But you're going to be given a Book of Mormon, and that book is about to change your life. Because in your third reading of the Book of Mormon, you're going to read 2 Nephi 2, which tells of Adam and Eve, and literally the last thing you'll ever expect is going to happen. You're going to believe it, almost like you're remembering it.
Hear that? Almost like you're remembering it. So again, there are a lot of examples of this in our missionary work.
Yep. My only quibble with that is I'd take that almost out. Yeah.
Yeah, you are remembering it. That's exactly what's happening. It feels like a memory because it is a memory. Let's look at another example. And this was an interview on Saints Unscripted a while back.
I started praying a lot more and really, really reading the Book of Mormon and praying with a sincere heart, asking God. I was like, I don't expect you to give me an answer when I open my eyes. I don't expect you to give me an answer today, but it's like, if you can just give me enough of wisdom and knowledge to understand what I'm reading is true, you'll take a great weight off of my shoulders, because I'm really, really concerned about my salvation. I know that you're there. I was at work one day and things were happening that day that it's almost like the more the missionaries were coming, the more I was learning. And the more I learned about pre-existence and things like that, like things just started clicking. I was like, I feel like I remember some of these things. I can't say for sure, but and again, maybe I'm going crazy, but there's things I just feel like I remember or things I already know. Like I feel like I made this deal with God to come here. I feel like I had met some, like there was this missionary who came into the house. I feel like I met him before. And he said the same to me. He's like, I feel like we've sat down and had this talk before. Not this particularly, but he said, I feel like we've sat down and talked before. And I really, really, really felt the same way. But there was things about the pre-existence that really, really hit home with me. Learning about a heavenly mother, that one really, really hit me hard also. But no, there was just things I feel like I knew or remembered or I heard this before. And I feel like that was the impression God was putting on me was, you've heard this before and now you're here. You chose this. So over the course of a while there, it was a long, hard road for me there trying to come into the church. But eventually there was things I just knew.
Interesting. Now, it's especially interesting. I want to focus on something that he said. He talks about feeling like he's remembering things in his discussions with the missionaries, right? And one of the things he focused on was the idea of a heavenly mother. Well, that brings up a question for Latter-day Saints. All right, we talk about Heavenly Mother sometimes, but we don't have a canonized scriptural account of Heavenly Mother. So why is it that so many Latter-day Saints are not able to not believe in a Heavenly Mother? Well, it's because there is an archetype in our spiritual memory of a mother figure, right? A divine feminine, a mother figure. Now, that archetype, when it comes up in different cultural contexts, you're going to have these evidences that we see of this mother figure in ancient Hebrew religion. And then also in Catholicism, there's so much criticism of Catholics online from Protestants in particular who say, oh, you worship Mary. And Catholics say, no, we don't. And Protestants say, well, then why do you do all these reverential behaviors and those kinds of things? Well, it's because Mary is kind of speaking to that archetype of a divine feminine, right?
Yes.
It's a spiritual memory. And so the way that memory is being manifest in Catholicism is with Mary, the mother of Jesus. That's why they feel very strongly about her. And we don't need to attack them over that, because we know that what's happening is that representation of Mary is speaking to an archetype of a mother, right? A divine feminine. And we can respect that, right? So here's an experiment to understand what we're getting at here. Here is an experiment. Put on some headphones. This is
fun. I did this after Dan suggested it.
Okay, good. Yeah, put on some headphones and listen to some hymns by the Tabernacle Choir. Restoration hymns like How Firm a Foundation or Now Let Us Rejoice.
The Spirit of God.
Yeah, good restoration hymns. And then listen to the Tabernacle Choir sing, Oh, My Father. That is a different kind of a hymn. The poetry that came from Eliza R. Snow, it is spiritual memory. in poetic form. Okay.
And the melody helps too.
Yeah.
It's
yeah.
a bit more haunting. It's minor key.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. It is going to feel different. All of these hymns are revelatory and they're all teaching the gospel. But Oh My Father feels different. It is spiritual memory set to music. Okay. So pay attention and sense the difference in feeling between those two types of hymns. If you want to understand what we're talking about when we talk about, the power of spiritual memory. So let's go back to this integrated model, right? With Jung, the bottom level was collective unconscious, but for us, we have this top level of consciousness, our thought processes and decisions at the level of awareness, mental and emotional processes below the level of mortal awareness, and archetypes, which are concepts and understandings shared by all of humanity that are from spiritual memory, right? It's not from evolution or diffusion. The archetypes are part of our spiritual memory. They're the forms of things that we experienced before, observed before, and that is why they're shared among all of humanity.
And it's collective because all of us we had a premortal life, and it's unconscious. We would say it's veiled.
Yeah. It's veiled. Absolutely. Now let's go back to the questions that we began with. So as we think about apocalyptic literature like the book of Revelation, 1 Nephi 13, 14, and experiences that people share with us or that they write about, what is the nature of this kind of experience? Because when we engage with apocalyptic, we tend to ask these questions. Again, is it a revelation from God? Is it a revelation from Satan? Is it a self-generated delusion? Okay. And our answer is possibly none of those. These experiences seem to have the features of memory that passes through layers of interpretation. Okay. Now, we need to talk about interpretation because that is a huge, huge factor here. And so let's talk about what we mean by that. What does it mean that spiritual memory is interpreted? This is going to be some hard work thinking through what it means to interpret something. But in this model, what we're saying is that a spiritual memory can come up at the archetypal level, like we just said about Catholicism. There's this archetype of a divine mother, right? And that is a spiritual memory that we have. Now, as that moves through our subconscious into our conscious, it's going to be like a game of telephone. Okay. Now, our subconscious, there's a lot going on there at that level that is going to shape what arrives in our consciousness. Another metaphor for that is, I love this meme of the guy looking through 6 pairs of glasses. So if I'm attempting to see a spiritual memory, right, or describe a spiritual memory, it's going to pass through a lot of lenses. And some of these are in my subconscious: cognitive categories, culture, life experience, worldview, values, and desires. A lot of these things are things that I'm not necessarily fully aware of. Okay. Let's talk about what that looks like in practice. Let's talk about the image of the cross, which is an archetypal image that Christianity shows to the world, right? And the reason why it's so powerful is because it is a spiritual memory. Jesus said, "When I'm lifted up from the earth, I will draw all people unto me." And he said this signifying by what death he would die. He says this again in the Book of Mormon a couple of times. He was lifted up to draw all people to him. Now, why is that? Look at these 3 images, okay? Sometimes I've seen people argue, and in my younger years, I might have even argued over this. Different cultures portray Jesus on the cross in different ways. And we might instinctively argue over whether these are right or wrong.
Historically speaking, yeah.
Yeah, historically speaking, we might say, oh, that's not right. So that's kind of a common tendency in discussions around different art that represents Jesus on the cross throughout the world. But the idea here is Christ went to the cross to offer an image that would speak to people on a much deeper level.
Mythically, remember this word myth we defined and spent a lot of time with earlier.
Right.
Jesus was a historical figure and did do what, scriptures say, but there's also this mythical layer that this is talking to that is also important that we can miss if we get to pedophagy about, was he African? Was he Asian? Was he? Yeah.
Yeah. So all of those questions, when people quibble over those things, they're missing the point. The point is this speaks to humanity on a very deep level.
And universal, deep and universal. Yeah.
Deep and universal, below our rationality and even below our subconscious. Okay. So it kind of doesn't matter the ethnic features of a particular representation of Christ. They're all correct. Right.
Speaking mythically, speaking and correct because Jesus did come to all mankind.
Correct.
So in that sense, this is mythically true.
Right.
Whatever the historical Jesus may have looked like, he did reach everyone.
Yes, he did. Now, in Jungian circles, they do talk about an archetype of a dying and rising God.
Yes.
This is one of those situations where history shows us a concrete, tangible reality of an archetype that comes to fruition in Jesus Christ. Okay. There was knowledge, innate knowledge of a dying and rising God among cultures all throughout the world before Christ actually went to the cross. But then he actually did it. He became the dying and rising God. And the archetype of the wounded healer as well. He came to personify that in flesh and blood reality. When we talk about mythical, we're not talking about ahistorical. We're not talking about something not being true. This happened.
So some people will use the mythic power to dismiss the history and say, well, the Hebrews, these Middle Eastern tribe just appropriated these stories that were marinating around. Of course, again, our notion of spiritual memory would say something different, right? Of course, those stories are found all over the place because we all remembered this was going to happen, right? It was the plan from the foundation of the world. Right.
And when, and it's definitely common in atheist circles to make that kind of an argument. Oh, this is found in mythologies all around the world, so it must not have happened, a dying and rising God. But what if there are witnesses to that, to that dying and rising God? Flesh and blood witnesses to that dying and rising God. The Book of Mormon, modern day witnesses, the Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians 15. That's why we talk about a cloud of witnesses around the Christ, the risen God, right? So this is an archetype that came to fruition in reality. And now we understand why everybody had this spiritual memory of it. The witnesses validate the archetype, basically, that this actually, this happened in reality. Again, these images here, these are interpretations of an archetype that are definitely shaped by culture, by life experiences. That's why we see the Christ depicted differently. It's because of all those layers of interpretation, and that is totally okay. They're all speaking to a core reality. Let's talk about interpretation of Scripture now, okay? Just to kind of highlight the power of reference points, okay? Isaiah 56 has this language of his watchmen are blind. They are all ignorant. Yea, they are greedy dogs. They are shepherds that cannot understand, right? He's talking about the leadership in ancient Judah, But there are other ways of interpreting this passage. So if you are Martin Luther or somebody living in the time of Martin Luther, you're going to say it must be talking about Pope Leo X, because man, this totally describes him, right? Or if you are a modern evangelical Christian and you're so frustrated at the influence of prosperity gospel teachers in the evangelical movement, you're going to look at that and say, yeah, they're greedy dogs, right? These people who are claiming to be spiritual leaders in Christianity. Or if you just interpret the text as literally as possible and are trying not to read too much into it, you're going to say his watchman. Well, that's a military function, sitting in a watchtower and, looking out over the landscape and surveying the landscape to see if there are any threats from adversaries, right? So there are different kinds of interpretation of this scripture, and your reference point is going to shape your interpretation, where you live, what you've been exposed to, and all those kinds of things. Now let's talk about another kind of interpretation. Okay, look at this headline from an article in the Deseret News. Father figure, perceptions of God may stem from father-child relationships. Wow. Sociologists say it's common for people to perceive that God is like the fatherly figures in their lives. If dad is caring, patient, and concerned, then children will believe God has those same characteristics. And the opposite holds true when a father is harsh, judgmental, or absent. A father has a powerful influence in deep and subtle ways, said David Dollahite, a professor of family life at Brigham Young University. Even though children know intellectually that God is fair, loving, and kind and patient, it's hard for them to relate to God at a gut level in a deep way if their own father is not that way.
I think this goes back at least to Sigmund Freud, this idea. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's true.
It is true. If a father is a horrible influence in a child's life, if a father behaves in terrible ways, the child is likely to interpret discussions of Heavenly Father and scriptural discussions of our Father in heaven and God in ways that reflect their life experience with their own father. They're going to interpret church leaders.
Other authority figures, yes. In analytic psychology, it's called a transference. You have this early experience, say with your father, and then that'll be transferred, that same kind of belief and perception, that one of those lenses that Dan, you had earlier, will be, distant, I'm going to see God, my dad was distant or caring. I have that same lens, caring, patient, concerned God, or harsh, judgmental, absent. That's this lens you're talking about.
Yep. So that's a layer of interpretation that a lot of people are just not aware of. They don't know how these relationships have impacted their experience of the gospel and gospel concepts. And
we should link to Wendy Ulrich's presentation at the Fair Conference from, I think, 2012 called Seeing Our Blindness, where she goes through this.
Yep.
It's really well done.
Okay, we will link to that in the notes then. Very good. Let's talk about an article that Dan Peterson wrote called Nephi and His Asherah. Okay, and he's talking about First Nephi, the apocalypse of Nephi, First Nephi 13 and 14, where, and this is definitely, an apocalyptic vision where Nephi is shown symbolic representations of things.
Yes.
Okay? The tree of life, what is that? And then he's shown the mother of the Lord. And listen to what Dan Peterson says here. He says, it should be apparent by now why Nephi, an Israelite living at the end of the 7th century and during the early 6th century before Christ, would have recognized an answer to his question about a marvelous tree in the otherwise unexplained image of a virginal mother and her divine child. Not that what he saw and how he interpreted those things were perfectly obvious. So listen to what he says here. Dan Peterson says, what he read from the symbolic vision was culturally colored. And then he talks about this apocryphal work called The Apocalypse of Paul. And he says it shows how cultural interpretation shapes meaning. The document relates a vision of the great apostle that, in this detail at least, strikingly resembles the vision of Nephi. And he, the angel, showed me the tree of life, Paul is reported to have said. And by it was a revolving red-hot sword, and a virgin appeared by the tree, and 3 angels who hymned her. And the angel told me that she was Mary, the mother of Christ. But Nephi's vision goes even further, identifying Mary with the tree. This additional element seems to derive from precisely the pre-exilic Palestinian culture into which the Book of Mormon tells us Nephi had been born. Okay. So Nephi's apocalyptic vision, this unveiling, this uncovering, it was shaped and formed by his cultural reference points. There were things that he would be familiar with. That is how these things were represented to him. That is very interesting. Okay. Now, here I'm going to just speak from personal experience on this issue of a vision or a dream being culturally colored. When I was a teenager, and I told Jeff about this recently, when I was a teenager, I started studying stuff about like the last days and the second coming. And I kind of went down that rabbit hole for a little while. And I was kind of alarmed, like things are going to get really bad in the last days. You know, I was kind of dwelling on that. And during that time, I had a dream. And in that dream, I was given a very vivid representation of a really awful thing that would be happening in the last days. I didn't read too much into it because I said that can't possibly be true. Like
that bad.
Yeah, things can't be that bad in the last days. And I just kind of filed it away. I never, ever told anybody about this dream until recently. As we started working on this project, I told it to Jeff. And first of all, the bad thing that was represented to me is basically happening in our day. Now, when I was a teenager, it was inconceivable. It was so outlandish, and that's impossible. But in our day, it basically is happening. But the form of how it was all represented to me was it within my reference points. And it was unique enough to where I was like, okay, I can't really regard this as revelation because that's so strange that it would be presented that way. Now, after talking through this Jungian approach to interpretation and how culture influences revelation, you know, now I can make sense of this dream that I had as a teenager, and it makes perfect sense to me. I'm not going to share it though. And but
did it help you situate yourself in the story?
Yeah.
Yeah, it did.
It actually did. It actually did. But it was definitely just for me. And there's no reason anybody else in the world has to know it, except Jeff.
It's not going to tell you what year Christ is coming or anything about that. So don't get excited.
Right. So let's go ahead and move on. And let's talk about interpreting the mother archetype. Now, we talked about how issues with one's father can affect their approach to faith. And I've long had a question, and that is in TV shows and movies where you have a strong female lead. Why is it that they always, without fail, introduce a plot thread where that woman's mother comes into the picture, right? And then there's this mother-daughter tension and conflict, and it's as predictable as anything. They always bring the mother into these shows. And you can see it across multiple TV shows, multiple movies.
In the fairy tales and myths of old, it's often a stepmother. We could go into the psychoanalytic reasons. There's a wonderful book that we weren't going to talk about, but that it's called The Uses of Enchantment. But it's often a stepmother because a mother was a little too close to home, but so we could work out our psychoanalytic conflicts with our real mother. by putting her one step removed.
There you go.
But
well, and with this one in Kanto, the conflict is with the grandmother.
that's true. Yeah.
So you have kind of this archetype of the feminine. And then you have the lived experience of femininity in the world. And there's tension between the archetype and the experience. And those things are kind of explored in these plot threads in movies and TV shows. They're kind of offering an interpretive tension. You know, how do you make sense of these different roles that emerge in our archetypal understanding of the mother, right? Now, let's talk about another layer of interpretation, and this is immensely important. It's the three temptations of Christ. Remember when Christ went into the wilderness and he was fasting, Satan approached him and said, "If you're the Son of God, command these stones to be made into bread." He took him up to a tower of the temple and said, "If you're the Son of God, throw yourself down, and then the angels will catch you. Everybody will see that," right? And then he shows him
Prove
the
your
kingdom.
beloved special Son of God. Yeah.
Yeah.
God will do anything for.
Right. And then he shows him the kingdoms of the world and says, "These can all be yours. All you got to do is worship me." So what he's telling Christ is, you need these things. You need to satisfy your physical cravings. You need validation, recognition, affirmation, and you need power and control. He's telling Christ, these are things that you need. Come on. You know you need these. I know you need them. Just worship me. And Christ sees through it and he rejects each of those offers, right? But you can see the appeal of them, right? So who doesn't want validation and recognition? You know, how great would it be for Christ to jump off, have the angels catch him, have everyone see that, and have there be no question whatsoever as to his divinity, right? Nobody would ever doubt him. It's all settled. He would never have any self-doubt, and he would be recognized and feel validated, right?
Yeah.
So what we call the process of conversion in our faith is developing Christ's answers to these questions, where we kind of see through what Satan is trying to do and we reject that. And part of conversion is we basically, each of those bottomless pits becomes a fountain of living water. So our appetites and cravings become patience and contentment, and our cravings for validation and recognition are transformed into love and belonging. Our cravings for power and control become trust, right? This is what conversion is in Christianity. So, why do we talk about these as an interpretive lens? Because if I am a bottomless pit of neediness, right? If I'm craving attention and power and all of those things, I am going to interpret the world around me. Everything that people do, all of the opportunities I'm presented with, I am going to interpret them through the lens of those three temptations.
And when we talk about the apocalyptic, what am I going to take the lid off? That's, I think, the most earthy way to think it. I'm that bottomless pit. I'm going to take that lid off. And what am I going to see in there? I'm going to see more bottomless pit.
Yeah, absolutely. So now let's talk about the three temptations in the psyche as we talk about them as an interpretive lens for the world, right? And let's start with the subconscious. That's where we have our unprocessed and unhealed trauma, disappointments, rejection, abandonment, and more. A lot of difficult life experiences that go back to childhood. We kind of stuff them down below our level of awareness. Otherwise, we would just be a wreck all the time. And they stay there, and until they're healed and transformed, they affect us greatly. Okay? President Spencer W. Kimball said, Jesus saw sin as wrong, but also was able to see sin as springing from deep and unmet needs on the part of the sinner. Okay. If you have all of this unhealed stuff, then you are going to crave things, and you are going to be susceptible to the three temptations, the three broad categories of sin. Physical appetites, validation and recognition, and power and control. Those are the three broad categories of sin. And if you subconsciously have all this hurt and resentment and grievance, it's going to point you to those three temptations. Now, Carl Jung expresses it in a little more secular way, but he's pointing to the same principle that President Kimball offered. He said, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. You will interpret the world and your faith and everything else from that neediness that arises from your hurts.
You will feel yourself to be a passive victim of it. Yes.
Right. You will not be running the show, right? Those things will drive you to do things and say things. And the three temptations are a very powerful interpretive lens. When we understand the three temptations, we understand a lot more about what drives us, and we're able to interpret our own instincts a lot better and the behaviors of other people. So, in light of that, what does this scripture mean? When Jesus said to Nicodemus, truly, truly, I say to you, if a person is not born from on high, or in other words, experience conversion, that person is not able to see the kingdom of God, right? Well, why not? If we're not born again, what will we see instead? How will we interpret our experiences? We're going to interpret our experiences through the lens of our personal agenda, whether we consciously understand it or not. We'll interpret it through our own expectations, our own narratives projected onto others. What does it mean to project onto others, Jeff?
It's similar to transference, but this is an internal experience that we can't see or can't own in ourselves. So again, if we're a bottomless pit where we need that validation, maybe we'll see others who seem really secure, will be threatened by them, or will really easily see in others their own insecurity, and maybe we will be repulsed by theirs because we haven't dealt with our own.
Yep. With projection, a lot of manifestations of it are, I feel and think X, therefore everybody else does. We assume that everybody else is motivated by all the same things that we are.
I love it. Korihor does this so much, where he accuses Alma of wanting to get rich and getting praise, which is exactly Korihor's MO.
Right. He's projecting his own motives onto Alma.
Mm-hmm.
Alma, you're just like me,
yep.
Right?
He's hardly that honest, but yes.
That's projection. That's projection. Okay. So, and another scripture, Matthew 5:8, blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. What does it mean to be pure in heart? Well, what if your heart is now free from your grievances and your hurts and your disappointments and rejections because it's all been healed? Now you can actually see God instead of seeing your hurts and grievances and projecting those outward onto the world.
Yeah.
And having those drive you. Right.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So now let's return specifically to the book Visions of Glory. And let's ask this question. So what is Visions of Glory? And again, we're going to say that we have a landscape of possibilities as we answer this question. Some people say it's revelation. Some people say it's false revelation, any number of things. What we see is a landscape of possibilities, and looking at it through the lens of kind of Carl Jung's thinking, we see some possibilities here on the landscape, right? And let's talk about, in Tom Harrison's own words, and he's the subject of the book, in a letter to his priesthood leaders, he talks about the book as containing his experiences, and he characterizes those as near-death experiences. And then you have the writer of the book, John Pontius's insights into the things I spoke with him about. Okay. Tom Harrison offers his layer of interpretation. John Pontius offers his insights, which is his layer of interpretation. And then it contains both Tom's and John's misinterpretations and errors. He says, there are doctrinally incorrect aspects of the book, so some being my perception and some being errors in the transmission of the work, some out of my or John's misinterpretation of what was being said or what was shown to me. And he said, pay attention to this. He said that Elder Maxwell told him, Brother Tom, do not try to interpret these things or read into them. Now think about that lengthy discussion we just had of what it means to interpret. Okay? Can you see
and
the
he also
wisdom?
told him to keep them personal. Yeah.
Yeah. Can you see the wisdom in Elder Maxwell saying, don't try to interpret this yourself? Why? It's true of every single one of us. When we are interpreting things, we bring so much to that equation, right?
And that dream you had 30 years ago,
yeah,
you remembered it. You didn't too obsess over it, but over time, it became clear in a way that if you'd have tried to force it at the time, you probably would have gotten it wrong.
Right. Correct. Yes, and now Visions of Glory, it contains some of John Pontius's own storytelling, and Tom Harrison says that might be a third or more of the book. He says, I would estimate that a third of the book was John's interpretation of what I had seen or experienced, or even that more of the content of the book was the facility that an author needed to use in placing of these experiences into a context and a storyline scenario. And he says it was not an attempt to provide an in any way doctrinal or a true account of what we as a people have in store for us. Now, if you are somebody who has read Visions of Glory, and there are a lot of people who have responded to it in different ways. Some people have responded very well. Like, yeah, I read the book, thought it was interesting, and take it or leave it, whatever. But some other people have responded very badly to it and actually kind of made it like a second book of scripture. And they've done some pretty terrible things in response
Take
to
it more literally and specifically.
Right.
And have projected and transferred.
Correct.
In there.
Correct. All of that is interpretation.
Yeah.
All of that is interpretation. So here on the left, you have the source, right? Offering his interpretation of a spiritual memory. And then you have a writer offering his interpretation of the source's interpretation. And then you have the reader, which brings their own layer of interpretation on top. You can see how many possibilities there are for something to go wrong in that
distortions, falsities, errors. Yes.
Right. Now, if you are somebody who read that book and you're like, wait a minute, I feel deceived. I feel like I was, some people actually feel betrayed when they find out that there were all those liberties taken in the creation of the book. And I would say, relax, stop. Don't jump into this narrative of, oh, I was fooled.
Yeah, I mean, John is dead. He died of cancer, I think, so he can't defend himself. But I don't know that it would be fair to say it was a bad faith effort.
Right. Correct. So don't be thinking, oh, I was fooled. Because the reason why this book appealed to you, why it spoke to you, was you do have a legitimate memory of apocalyptic. It's one of these narrative archetypes. Now, how did we get a narrative archetype of apocalyptic? Well, if you read in the book of Revelation, you have three settings for the book of Revelation. You have the revelator speaking to his own time and his own context. You have him speaking to far in the future, to the end times. And then right there in Revelation 12, you have him talking about the pre-existence.
Yes.
That's where we get the story. There was a war in heaven. It's right there in Revelation 12. And Michael fought the dragon, right? The hero confronts the dragon. These are archetypal memories of premortality. Why would there be that narrative of premortality situated right in the middle of the book of Revelation? Well, because it's the same form It's the same thing. Apocalyptic it's a form of the way things go. There is a grand conflict that occurs when good and evil engage with each other, right?
And Visions of Glory's appeal is probably still mythically true, where we wander, where there's persecution, where there's trials, where there's the power of God in the lives of the faithful. All of these things are true, if not the specifics.
Right. And so that is why apocalyptic will reach you.
Yeah.
Because it is speaking at that mythical archetypal level. It's speaking to something that you remember down very deep, right? So
and if we were placed here in these latter days, perhaps us more than other eras too.
Correct. I would actually agree with that. I think that's a very valuable insight. Now, and that brings us to this question. There are horror stories of how people have responded to visions of glory. So how do you process apocalyptic well? All right. Let's read this quote from Carl Jung. He says that people should succumb to these eternal images is entirely normal. And he's talking about archetypes. In fact, it is what these images are for. They are meant to attract, to convince, to fascinate, and to overpower. You can see why, Jesus says, I'm going up on the cross to draw people to me. There's this power in that image. It's archetypal power. He says they are created out of the primal stuff of revelation and reflect the ever unique experience of divinity. That is why they always give man a premonition of the divine, while at the same time safeguarding him from immediate experience of it. And I would add, because if you experienced the divine in full, you would probably lose your mind because you are not prepared for it. None of us are. So sometimes things need to be represented to us in a way that we can digest them, right? And that's the power of archetypes and allegory and metaphor and, having reality represented to us in ways that, again, we can work with it, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so let's get specific, though, and I'm going to run through these fairly quickly. How do we process apocalyptic well? Well, keep an open mind, but don't turn off your critical thinking skills. Honestly, some apocalyptic literature simply is fraud. It's made up. Nobody had any experience.
But it's perhaps too pejorative. It was plagiarized.
Right.
So they took the themes, put them together in a way that they knew would be appealing.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, also be aware of the layers of interpretation that we all bring to our experiences. We talked about some of those layers, and there are more layers, right? We bring a lot to the world around us and the way we engage with ideas and faith and people and everything. Be careful not to get swept away mentally and emotionally, especially fear, grandiosity, hero worship, and sensationalism. Develop healthy thinking around preparedness and take positive steps. Sometimes people get wrapped up in apocalyptic literature and they go wild and they get excessive and fanatical.
They spend too much money.
Right.
They act out of fear.
Right. There is a healthy way of approaching emergency preparedness. Do that. And avoid kind of, extremist voices. Develop healthy relationships and healthy spirituality. Don't try to force things that cannot be forced. Sometimes you might read of an experience that somebody had and say, oh, I need that. So
I want to have my own.
Yeah, I need my own.
It's not bad to pray for that. I mean, that's how Nephi got his own experience of the vision. But do we force it, right?
Do we force it? And some people will ingest chemicals to force it, rather than patiently working through the process on God's terms, which might be a lifetime of work, right?
Yeah.
Jeff, give us number 7.
We talked about how psychosis is a failure of reality testing. And so some people say if we're skeptical in the sense that we don't automatically believe everything that someone may be claiming, that we're being faithless or perhaps sign seeking, right? Because Jesus condemns those that seek a sign because they're looking for reasons not to believe. But if you look at where the Lord in the scriptures does give signs, it is to let you know it's from him. I have a whole article about how the temple teaches about authentication protocols. There's so much attention in the temple ceremonies given to where is this coming from, right? How do I know this is from God the Father? And so it is not being faithless and it is not being sign-seeking to say, God, is this from you? Is this really you? Am I really interpreting this correctly? And the other piece I'd add is that these things unfold in time. We can take steps along a path that we think God is leading out, and then sometimes we'll get a stop sign from the Lord, and we'll go, whoa, I got that wrong. Again, I think if we're humble and we're continually seeking the Spirit, God can correct us, but we need to be open to saying, you know what, I got that wrong. And I had this inspiration, I acted on it faithfully. But in this unfolding process that God acts through time and through us developmentally, I maybe took a wrong turn, and I'm going to make the correction. And I don't think any of those will be fatal, so long as we continue to be open about that reality testing.
Right. And finally, take responsibility for your own spiritual development and personal revelation. Okay. We talked about how people have responded to visions of glory and other apocalyptic works too, not just visions of glory. Some people have become fanatical. Some people have committed horrible crimes.
And they take every word as if it's literal. Yeah. And they outsource their own inspiration to John Pontius's interpretation of Tom Harrison's personal experience to him.
Right.
There's an abdication there too that is alarming.
Right. And they bring also, some of these people have brought the three temptations. They are bottomless pits. And then, hey, here's this apocalyptic literature. Well, guess what? They're going to interpret it in ways that reflect the bottomless pits. And they're going to do some really horrible things.
They've used it to their own grandiosity.
Yep.
To, we didn't, I don't think we talked about Jung's concept of inflation. Yeah. Where you can become possessed by these archetypes in an unhealthy way. We all have these archetypes, and all those archetypes can be healthily and should be healthily engaged with, but it can also be overdone, especially when we don't have people around us to help us say things like, hey, Jeff, you're getting carried. Do you think you're getting carried away here?
So I'll just pause right here and say, Jeff is one of the people who helps me to not get carried away. Everybody should have a friend like Jeff. That's what I think.
And like Dan, yes.
So, Jeff, you mentioned inflation. When in that last quote from Jung, where he talked about becoming overcome by these things.
That's it. Yeah.
Yeah. The archetypes are powerful. If you internalize the archetype of a hero through movies and culture and stuff, and then you say, I have to be that. Yeah. Or an archetype of a prophet, or an archetype of a wise man.
I'm a Latter-day Nephi, or I'm the second coming of Joseph Smith, or I'm Captain Moroni, reincarnated.
Right. Or I'm the wounded healer of everybody. Right.
I'm the one that can heal everyone. Yeah.
Yeah. That's what Jungian analysts, they call that inflation. And Jung, that's what he meant when he talked about being overcome by these things. You make it into your persona, what you want to show the world, and that is incredibly destructive.
Some of those things might be true, but you could see how the adversary or our own human fallenness can cause us to warp those things. I do think all of those things are in a sense true. All of us should be healers. All of us need to be heroic in certain ways, but there's this sense of grandiosity and egoism in it that is where it gets unhealthy. Right. I'm the only one. I'm the one that's going to heal the church and cleanse it from all its wickedness, for example, or whatever.
Right.
Yeah.
And you take that archetype onto yourself, and you leave a trail of wreckage behind you. It always happens. Okay.
Look at the fruits. Yeah.
Yep. Okay. Now we are going to close with this slide, and Jeff, you need to lead us through it. I think it's so important. Go ahead.
Yeah, don't go the other extreme either. So we call this puzzle the donkey is both a snare and a sign. So we've made no secret of the fact we're all C.S. Lewis fans on this channel. And the last book in the Chronicles of Narnia, The Last Battle, is an apocalyptic allegory. And in it, of course, Aslan is the Christ figure. And an ape finds a lion's mane, a lion's skin, and he puts it on Puzzle the donkey and uses it to get everybody excited. Look, Aslan's back. Aslan's been gone for a long time. He said he'd return. Here he is. Look at this lion. The interesting thing about this metaphor, there's many things that we'll cover here. First of all, Puzzle himself is not the bad guy. It's the ape. It's the guy behind him kind of pushing him up there and doing it. Puzzle's just kind of naive and gets swept up in it and probably ought to know better, but himself is not a bad faith guy either. But everybody gets sensational. Everybody gets worked up and excited about this puzzle. Is this the real Aslan? And then the people that are skeptical are like, well, don't you believe that Aslan's coming back? Why are you so faithless? Why aren't you believing? Why aren't you supporting this Aslan? And so then the interesting thing is there is really Aslan there, but he's much more quiet and he only comes to the more meek and humble in the world. And so everybody's caught up in this false Aslan and they don't see what the real Aslan is doing. And, we believe in our church. I'll use an example that I think is important. We believe in our church in secret combinations. But is that the same thing as conspiracy theories? I think some of the so-called conspiracy theories are actually distracting us from the real and the damaging secret combinations, just like maybe some of this hysteria around some of these apocalyptic gurus and famous people might be distracting us from maybe the real preparation and the real ways we can see God acting in our own lives. Instead of some charismatic person, are we not seeing how God is preparing us and God is maybe working through us? Well, then finally, Puzzle is exposed. And then some people say, all right, well, that shows that was all a load of hokum. And there is no real Aslan. I'm not going to be fooled again, right? The dwarves in there, they just descend into rank partisanship. And the rest of the book, they're just like, the dwarves are for the dwarves. And again, we see that partisanship that you've talked about a lot, Dan, where, all right, I'm not going to be fooled again. I'm not going to believe anything. I'm just going to fall into my tribe and my people and that. And so the last thing I'll say is what I love about that allegory that C.S. Lewis did is the presence of Puzzle the donkey is obviously it trips people up. So he's a snare. But as we have been told in Scripture, the proliferation of false Christs, and I would expand that to this distracting and harm-causing apocalyptic, over-enthusiastic apocalyptic thinking is itself a sign of the nearness of the second coming. We can maybe all feel this shift in times and things are getting closer. Our church leaders have told us that. And so we have been warned. Like here, I like the Joseph Smith version of this scripture. For in those days there shall also arise false Christs and false prophets, and shall show great signs and wonders. Will be very charismatic and very exciting and very attention-getting, and shall, insomuch that if possible, they shall deceive the very elect, who are the elect according to the covenant. And let me add to this Luke 17:23, where he says, neither shall they say, lo here, lo there, for behold, the kingdom of God is within you. There are examples, and we probably shouldn't get specific, of people actually picking up and leaving, kidnapping people or running off to other places to say, oh, I've got to go do that. And that's, again, I would say, where's the reality testing there? Because Harold B. Lee put it this way in Conference of April 1948. He said, the Lord has placed the responsibility for directing the work of gathering in the hands of the leaders of the church, to whom he will reveal his will, where and when such gatherings would take place in the future. It could be well before the frightening events concerning the fulfillment of all God's promises and predictions are upon us, that the saints in every land prepare themselves and look forward to the instruction that shall come to them from the first presidency of this church as to where they shall be gathered, and not to be disturbed in their feelings until such instruction is given to them as it is revealed by the Lord to the proper authority. So, unlike these people that claim they have a secret anointing or they have some secret angelic ordination to lead the church, this is one of the reasons we give common consent in the church, right? We sustain, there is no mystery about who is in the quorum of the 12. There is no mystery in who is even our area authority and our stake president and our bishop. All of those things is done by common consent. So it is commonly known who the leaders are. We all have the ability to find out if someone says, I'm an apostle, I'm a general authority 70, we can check. Harold B. Lee is warning us to make sure that any instructions that come, for instance, to gather, but could be whatever it is, are going to come through as a people and as a church. It's not going to be some charismatic member that says, okay, we're going to get ready, get your food storage, and let's go to Idaho, or not to rip on Idaho, it's a beautiful state, but it is going to be from the leaders of the church that we will know that it is the leaders of the church.
Right. Now, and that's a fantastic set of points that Jeff has just made. I would only add, thinking about that image of the lion skin on a donkey.
Yeah.
Right? It's important to understand a lot of people have engaged with apocalyptic literature like Visions of Glory and other books. And seeing a lion skin on whoever the author is of that book, they have lost confidence that we are led by a prophet of God in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Mm-hmm. A lot of people who get into this stuff, you ask them, is President Nelson a prophet of God? And they will get really uncomfortable and just, try to avoid answering.
They'll wiggle around.
Yeah.
They'll hem and haw.
Right. It's because
they'll sustain him, but they don't.
Right.
It's not really have all the gifts and a key or using the keys, whatever. Yeah.
Right. It'll be some kind of mush of ideas that allow them to avoid saying the very simple statement, we are led by a prophet of God.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And I sustain him. Yeah.
Yeah. And I sustain him. Now, if the stuff that you are exposing yourself to makes it so you lose that perception, you need to step away from it. It really is that simple.
Yeah.
Okay. So this has been a tour de force discussion of apocalyptic. Thank you so much, Jeff. This was
thank you, everybody. Yeah.
Yeah. And I really hope this is helpful for clarifying and, giving us kind of some new and fresh tools for thinking about these things. And if you know somebody who's kind of caught up in this in unhealthy ways, feel free to share this with them. That's why we created it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks again. Bye-bye. This has been an episode of Latter-day Presentations. We would like to remind viewers that our channel represents our own views and not necessarily any official positions of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Thanks again for joining us.